Jessica. Thank you. Lenny, does that help on your end?
We're good.
Awesome. APA, like I've tried to in response to that award. The publication, yes. So that summarizes some of the main legacies of his research. He's also just a really warm, fantastic human to work with. I mentioned to them, Lenny, that you were my dissertation chair, and just really supportive of students at DePaul, and served as a mentor to many, many, many of us, I know. Do you want me to say a little bit about, I have some material to summarize Oxford houses.
Sure.
So Oxford houses are designed to address the lack of environmental supports for people following completion of substance abuse treatment. They are affordable, safe housing that houses up to 6 to 12 residents. But one of the things that really sets them apart from more traditional recovery home models is that they're self-governed. So there aren't professional staff in Oxford houses. They're peer-led, they're democratic in their processes. The requirements for residents are that they pay rent and abstain from drugs and alcohol. It's the largest residential recovery network in the country. And then I think in that article that Dr. Jason shared with us, also the Oxford houses speak to the value of ecologically sensitive intervention and community collaboration. I love that you share in that talk the story of how that partnership formed and all of the years of investment that you put into building the collaboration with Oxford houses to be able to create a meaningful research partnership and to build evidence in this area where we really need it. So thank you so much for taking some time to join us today, Dr. Jason, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Good. Well, thank you. Very appreciate your introduction. So sometimes people ask, well, how does one get involved in an area? And in this area of recovery homes was not something I spent early part of my career on, though I was interested in addictions and tobacco and drugs, not recovery homes. But I think it was both theory and method that sort of got me interested in working, particularly with recovery homes and in Oxford House in specific, as Liz has mentioned. So what's the theory? Real briefly, I was concerned in the late 1980s and early 1990s that I just saw the more things change, the more they stay the same. And that got me concerned when I looked at, for example, mental hospitals, where you had millions of people in the 1950s and 60s, and then we see them changing. The hospitals getting closed down, some very progressive things with Johnson and Kennedy in the 60s and others. But then we have another change occurring in the late 70s and 80s with different administration, Reagan and Nixon, where we see prisons starting to really grow and emerge. So the actual number of people was really no different that were institutionalized either in mental institutions, which gradually began to become very small, or prisons and jails, which actually began to house many people. So the actual number of institutionalized people stayed about the same. And that concerned me of saying, well, what can we do? How can we make a difference? And then I heard about recovery homes where they were located everywhere. Every town, every city, every state has these different settings, which are at least are trying to kind of help people with an alternative. It turns out that there's about 270,000 people every year who are actually in these recovery homes. That's a huge number. In addition, it turns out that about the majority of these individuals certainly have been housing insecure, but they also have, in a sense, high rates of homelessness, high rates of psychiatric comorbidity, and actually high rates of criminal justice involvement. So you think about it, these are the exact individuals that we as clinical and community psychologists want to work with. And when people come out of jail or prison, and there's hundreds of thousands that come out of these settings every year, the two things they ask for are, can I find a safe place to live? And can I get a job and have an income? Those are the two things that our society systemically does not provide those opportunities. So how do we get people so that they avoid going into jail and prison? And if they're in jail and prison, how do we help those individuals get reacclimated, sort of reaccepted, adjusted into their post-prison environment? So I got very interested in this phenomena called recovery homes, and in specifically Oxford House. It turns out that in California, there are some Oxford houses, but they're probably more likely to be sober living houses. And there's hundreds of them. And the individuals in those recovery homes and Oxford houses are very special places, because particularly with COVID-19, we often think about what do we do for people who are, in a sense, high risk. Well, if you think about the folks who are in these recovery homes, they are high risk from multiple points of view. And I haven't even talked about chronic illnesses, but if you've been in addiction for many years, you often have a number of chronic illnesses as well that you're dealing with. So here we have individuals in these particular settings that are trying to figure out how to live together, how to change some of their patterns. So think of it this way. The theory would suggest that we need to do something that's systemic. Recovery homes is one place that has a sort of an environment that gives people a chance. Why does it give people a chance? Because it potentially changes their social networks. So if we could sort of figure out a way of changing social networks inexpensively, we would say, that's it. So think about the clients and the patients that you deal with. Basically, they tend to sort of be involved with other folks who are maybe doing illicit activities, maybe using substances, probably involved in these types of influences that gets them in trouble and ends up in these types of negative outcomes. So how do you take a person who's associating with basically individuals who are doing criminal activity, who are doing rates of potentially substance use, who are basically at risk for potentially getting COVID-19 because of the individuals that they're associating with? How do we change their social networks so that they're in a network where everybody is working, where everybody is not taking alcohol or drugs, particularly if you have a substance use disorder, where people are, in a sense, associating with others who are being successful in our society in some ways? Well, that's what spoke to me when I heard about the recovery homes, in particular, the ones that I've been working with, although I work with some with NAR, which is a very large organization, and Oxford House is the other very large organization. But there's thousands of these houses. And the interesting thing is, they want us to work with them. There's open receptivity doing clinical work or research work with these particular samples of individuals who are trying to make a difference in their life. So let me give you a quick story to make it concrete, so that you can sort of see what it's like to basically change from the people, places, and things that you are doing in a way that's inexpensive. And why is it inexpensive? Because Oxford houses are always rented. Nobody buys the Oxford house. It doesn't cost anything to basically purchase it. You rent it. And the people in the house pay their fair share. So you don't need to have local, state, or federal resources to, in a sense, make sure that house exists. They pay $100 to $130 a week, which is very reasonable. And they have room in it. So if there's someone who has COVID-19 or someone who's at risk, they can sit in the room alone for a couple of weeks until they're quarantined. So there's mechanisms in these recovery homes to actually help people who are at risk or who have COVID-19. So here's a very quick example that kind of struck me, that got my excitement. And this guy I met, and he basically said, you know, I came out of jail and prison. I stole, I ripped people off. I was a substance use addict. Addict's not the appropriate word, that's the word he used. So we call them substance use disorder these days. But in any event, he goes to an Oxford house, which are over about 25,000 people living in these Oxford houses today. Um, and he has to get accepted. The Oxford House has to vote you in with the majority, because if they don't want you to join their community, then they're not going to accept you. And why do they accept you? It doesn't matter what you've done before. You can be a felon. You can be a murderer. You can have done anything, absolutely anything. If you have a desire to change and be substance free, they will let you into the house. That's it. That's the only criteria. It has nothing to do with anything that's ever happened to you. So this guy comes to the house and he says, okay, I want to be accepted. The house makes a decision. They interviewed him as a group and they said, you're in. Here's a key to the house. The guy says, a key to the house? Wait a second. Don't you realize you can't trust me? I've stole from my relatives. I've ripped people off. I cannot be trusted. Do not give me a key to this house. I've just gotten out of prison and jail. I've been a substance user. I've got all types of problems. I don't want the responsibility of this key. And they said, no, everybody gets a key. You're part of the community. What did that do? That began to change his conception of who he was. It began to alter the roles and the schemas he had about who he was in relationship to society. Because this was a society that was middle class. This was a society that had a color TV. This was a society that was neat, that was orderly. This was a society that had people going to meetings, AA meetings, NA meetings. This was a society where everybody was working and was expected to work. And if you didn't have a job, you had time to get a job. And because you'd be going around finding, and how do you get a job? Not through a social worker, but you got a job because someone in the house took you to where they were. And they're often low income jobs, but it would get you started. So you're now in an environment where everyone's working, no one's doing illegal activities, and they're developing friendships. Interesting. In our research, we found that if you find one friend in that house, that's the biggest predictor of long-term success. So that's why we study friendship. So the method is really dictated by the environment of a house and how we can understand how individuals affect other individuals by trusting, by learning how to accept, willing to share, and to develop friendships and advice. So those are the things that we study in Oxford houses. Let's get back to the case study. This particular guy, 6 months later, is doing fine. Everybody in the house has a role. So they vote him. They vote him to become the treasurer. And he's, wait a second, the treasurer handling the money. I can't be the treasurer. I've ripped people off. I've stolen. I've embezzled. I've been going to jail for this. I am no good. You can't give me this job. I refuse. And they say, no, this is your next step, to have some leadership within the house. And they convinced him to become the treasurer. So all of a sudden, his idea of who he is and his responsibility to others begins to dramatically change. And that's what it's about. How do we get the process of change? It's not by individually us just trying to change them. It's by the social networks. It's by the environments that change people. How do we develop those social environments? How do we work with them? How do we understand them in our work so that it's not just us, but it's us working with them to bring about change?
Thank you so much, Lenny. I really appreciate that you highlighted both the power of meeting people's basic needs, the transformative power of relationships, and also how that can really shift our self-concepts and help us imagine different possibilities for ourselves that we may have been told our whole lives weren't options or weren't roads for us. I know we just have a few minutes, so I want to, again, kind of open up the floor to start. What questions do you all have for Dr. Jason?
I do have a question. Thank you for that story because it really painted a very clear picture and was really beautiful. I am curious what happens when you elect that person to be treasurer and then they make a mistake and money is stolen, and then they feel validated in the fact that you shouldn't have trusted me. How do you rebuild, like, you're still a trustable person even though you stole the money?
So what happens is you're put on contract, and a behavioral contract is set up. It's very contingency oriented. They developed it themselves. And you will have consequences, and you will be asked to do certain things. And then you will give another contract if you continue to violate it. So for example, on smaller types of things, you might get a $50 fine, or you might get a one-on-one where you have to go around and talk to everybody in the house about what happened. Or the house can say, that's it. You violated the rules so many times that you're out, and they will vote you out. And then there's a family that says you cannot live here anymore, but if you want to try to come back and you get yourself some help, we're happy to re-accept you if you're willing to. So basically, they will not let you be in the house to be disruptive or using alcohol or drugs. But if you can figure out a way to sort of change your behaviors, they will accept you back.
Which so powerfully highlights, the role of that democratic process. I love that piece.
Yes.
We have time for one more question. If folks have another question for Dr. Jason. This has been part of my adjustment to Zoom, Lenny. So just so you know, this is quite typical when we move to discussion. I think it's a lot harder for people to jump into a full Zoom room. This isn't specific to Oxford houses, Lenny, but one of the things I so appreciate, I won't tell all the stories here, but I've heard so many stories of you embarking on community partnerships and research projects because of something you encountered in your personal experience. That whether it's like attending a community meeting and what the community members want to study, whether it's your own lived experience, or whether it's like watching something on 60 Minutes. And I'm trying to formulate my question, but I guess I think it's just been such a hallmark of your career, and I'm curious if you have any reflections on that piece for students about ways of taking things you notice in the world and bringing that back into, starting a research partnership or combining it, with intellectually what you're already observing.
Yeah, well, the story with Oxford House is, I saw Paul Malloy, who started Oxford Houses, on 60 Minutes. And next day I said, boy, that's kind of cool. So I called him up. I've never called anyone that I've seen on TV before, but it's going with your gut. Believe that your instincts are good and follow them. And sometimes you'll do the most outrageous thing, like call someone that you saw on 60 Minutes and just have a conversation and say, hey, I'd like to get to know you and your group. And would you like to get to know me and my group? And that's what we did. And in a sense, by just going with what's natural, going with, in a sense, what you believe in, sticking true to your values and what you're really interested in, you're motivated by, that's probably the most important thing. And I guess your interests will change. That's okay, but stick with them. And that's what basically keeps us often on projects for the long period that allow us to make a difference. Because it's like becoming an architect, archaeologist, sociologist, political scientist. You've got to know all the layers, and the extent that you know the history and all the individuals and characters, you have a better chance of basically intervening in a way that will make a substantial change.
Thank you so much for speaking to that. I realize it's slightly off topic, but I was reflecting on your work, and just something that came up for me is that I think your willingness to do that and to act on what you see is part of what's made your work so cutting edge over these years, that you've often started to address social issues before they were acknowledged as areas of need. And just really appreciate that.
Good. Well, thank you very much.
Lenny, it's so great to have you join us again. Really lovely to see your face and your smile. I want to hold on to you, and I'm also explicitly working on time management as a growth edge this class, and want to be mindful of your time as well. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, and enjoyed having a chance to chat with your class. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, Lenny.